Hello and welcome storytellers and change makers to Story the Future Learning Encounter. We are still here in our first week, and today we are excited to bring back to you for a second time one of our favorite partners from the first Story of the Future, and that's Chine Swart, who was just a hugely popular conversation that we had. And she has something really important to say about this conversation that we're having here in the Learning Encounter, which is all about putting story to work. You know, one of the things that came up from the first Story of the Future is a lot of our audience said, oh, wow, I'm a story activist and I didn't even realize it. And I want to start stepping into this work even more intentionally. Can you help us do that? Well, Chine Swart is a ideal guide and coach for people who are stepping into this work, because one of the things that we talk about in story work is not just that it's about influence. You know, if leaders tell stories, you can get people to buy your product, right? But that the bigger opportunity is that it is about change, and that we can see ourselves differently and we can see the world differently. It's about reauthoring. And Chine does tremendous work in this area. So Chine, thank you for joining us today. We're so excited to have you back.
Great to be back.
So let's just jump right in. So as we talk about this idea, Chine, that story is a path to change, that there's some relationship between the stories we tell and the results that we get professionally or personally. Tell us about that. What does your work look like?
Yeah, I was thinking about that question because it's really, how does it feel like, or what does it bring? And maybe when you're an observer, you can see what it looks like. But I can say a little bit about what would happen. What are the ingredients that you'll find if you look at it? This is what you'll see happening. So I think the first thing is that in a world where story has been captured, according to me, you know, the word storytelling is so broadly used that people here in Africa in particular would think that they don't have a story to tell. Because Africans can really tell good stories, which is also a generalization. But I use and work with moments, which is the smallest unit for me of a story. And when I ask people, tell me about a moment, everybody thinks that they can do it. It sounds small enough for people to enter. So that's the first thing. I work with moments, and I make visible moments that people might have long forgotten, moments that people don't even know existed. They would often say, oh, I forgot about that. How did that happen? Oh, I didn't know that moment was so important. So when I work with story, I use the smallest ingredient for me, which is the moment. And a moment is so rich that it also gives us then, I use the lemniscate, I don't know how you say that in English, the figure 8, the infinity sign.
Infinity, yes.
Which is the moment gives us all the clues for what matters to us. And then we go to what does that mean? And so my work is really the facilitation of moments and meaning, which then in the continuous loop of the 8 really brings us the story, brings the story forward. That's how I would describe my work, as making visible that which is hidden. And I listen, you would see me, what does it look like? You would see me listening. You would see me ask questions that surprise people. I think we live in a world where so often questions are easy to answer, like takeaway meals. You know, we know the answer to the question, so it doesn't spark our imagination or surprise us in any way. So I ask questions that surprise people, and connectedness, a huge chunk of human connectedness, a human to human endeavor is what you'll see and what it will look like. So I think that, and I think the next step after you've done the weaving is also to say, how do I weave this into my future? How I weave this into my life? So there's a moment where I perform the story, I perform the moment, but then what does it mean for my life? And what does it then continuously mean for my life? Which is really, how do we weave these precious moments, which can become great stories as a continuous practice into our lives. And I think that, I don't know if that's an answer to your question.
No, I love that. And I love the idea of moments, because I work with leaders and organizations. And I encounter the same thing that you just said, which is people say that they don't have a story. You know, leaders always say that. And one thing I experience is, you know, leaders will step up to tell their story, and they'll start by saying, well, I want to tell you about a client that we worked with. It was a utility organization that was $3 billion in the marketplace, and they had 7 strategic challenges. And they'll start telling this really high-level, complex case study. And I'm constantly trying to bring them down to these really human stories where something really specific happened. And I haven't used that word moment. And that strikes me as being really powerful.
Yes, and people are not intimidated by it. You know, it sounds small enough for them to enter. And I think for me also what happens in the leaders having to tell story business is that they tell about things, but they don't take us there. And that's for me a huge difference. I can intellectually tell you about the numbers and how it came about, but I am not moved by that kind of telling. I'm not taken with. And in a certain sense, for me, the making visible is making everything visible that made that moment possible. It is I call it portals into moments, like Bugs Bunny's, I don't know if you know the Bugs Bunny magical doors. You know, he would be running away or towards, and suddenly this magical door would open and he would go through to another world. And I see these, I call it portals. And those are small mechanisms that help people to take us to the moment and not to only tell about the moment. And one is the senses. What did you smell? What did you see? What did you hear? What was the touch on your skin in that moment? What happened in your body in that moment is another portal. Was nature present in that moment? Sometimes people can even remember the time of the day. Did it rain or didn't it rain? Was the sun shining? And then was there art or beauty in that moment? And beauty is not in the consumerist sense of beauty, plastic beauty. It is beauty that could be tears, that could be something sad even. So was there any beauty in that moment? And another door is mystery. Sometimes people would tell about a moment that said it's unexplainable. There was mystery in that moment. And I think then you already have a loaded experience of being taken there and taken with. And people have told a tremendous, beautiful story without realizing that they have now been storytellers, if they just use these magical doors. I also call them story whisperers. That these openings, these portals help us and whisper in our ear, oh, the moment was also about this. It was also about that. And I think the next portal for me is community. Who, dead or alive, would know that this moment matters to you? It could also be animals. It could also be places. It could also be musical instruments. That would not be surprise. And for me, that's another level of seeing the moment. I call them the story keepers, because they remember the community that loves you. These are people that support you. It doesn't have to be blood family, but they would be your life support club. They love what you do. They want to support you in everything. And this community is then also asked the question. The question is, who in your life would not be surprised that you would take us to this moment? Firstly, who would have predicted that this is an important moment in your life? Firstly. And then you say, to which moment would they take us to help us understand why this is so important to you? And so many people have told me that the community or the story keeper's moment is the real moment, is the most important moment. Because we don't always remember everything. And so sometimes we need the community to remind us of what matters to us deeply. So that's for me a second way to enter and tell a story, not only to help others, but also for yourself and your own life. And then the third one is language. A word creates a world. The way people choose to language their lives is for me the most important thing. In a country with 11 official languages, that is super important, because by the time you get the English word out, it might not be the right word, but it is the word you have chosen. And so to honor that and not to correct people and say, is it really that word? But to honor the language that people use and imagery. So once you've got the moment, you've taken people there, the community is also giving you a moment. You say, what would you call this moment if you had to write a chapter in a book? How would you name this? Or what imagery would you give it? That's another way to tell the story and to bring the story to life and to take people with. And so for me, those are all ways that could help people take us there in a way that we don't feel that we are being convinced or influenced, but we are held in that moment.
Well, so there's so much I want to ask you about. So you briefly mentioned this idea of naming your story. And this is something that comes up in the conversations I have with leaders as well, that there's something powerful about that. What is it? Why do we name the story? What does that do, or why is that powerful?
Because we are languaging beings. The way we name the world creates the world in a certain sense. Yeah. Wittgenstein said we cannot, understand the world if we cannot name the world. And therefore the naming is so important, because we are languaging beings, and we do it through, we make meaning through language. And so our words are always partially trying to name what is emerging anyway. But for a moment, there is a name for it. And then I can be also, that's the one thing. And the other thing is, when I name it, I can be in relationship to it. That's the other thing. If I don't name it, it's always something somewhere in my head.
Yeah.
But once I've named it, I can say, well, this is how I want to be with it, whatever the it might be, or be with the moment itself. Even, there I go in Afrikaans. Right. Sorry about that. It's been a while.
No, I think about we name our kids when they're born. My kids are named Emery and Ollie, and my wife and I named them that. And now we can't imagine them being named anything else. That's who they are. They can't imagine being named anything else. And there's something about naming our story that similarly, we have all these narratives floating around in our heads, and there's something about holding one out and observing it and giving it a name that it brings it to life.
And it also sets you up as an author of the story. It also sets you up as outside of the story.
Yeah.
And not inside of the story, you are a mere character. But when you have named it, you get into a relationship, you become the author, and therefore you can re-author. And that's also what's important about naming and languaging.
Wow. So bring us even deeper into this and show us what it looks like. Can you tell us about perhaps a client or a leader or someone you worked with where you helped them get a breakthrough, or where they discovered a breakthrough in reauthoring their story?
So I have seen about 4 kinds of what you call breakthroughs. Insights, whatever people would call what happened to them. The first one is when people remember a moment that has real significance to them, you would see their body shift and move. Their eyes would lit up, they would laugh, they would cry, there would be human expressions. And what is being said, that the reauthoring happens in the re-experiencing of something that matters to us deeply. So in general, and I'm not giving a particular story, I can see that a moment happened, a real moment I was taken to in the body. The body says, this is a moment that matters. So in the sense, that is a breakthrough, because the body doesn't lie. The body tells you something is happening right now. So that's one thing that I've seen. The other thing, the moment is never in a vacuum. The moment always happens in a context with taken for granted beliefs and ideas. I'll give you an example in my own life. I grew up as an Afrikaner woman in a Christian religious culture, which means that it was good for a woman to be silent. And it was good for a woman to serve. And for a long time, I had a lot of struggle and conversations inside of me thinking that there was something wrong with me. But the moment I realized that there's a whole context that keeps certain stories alive in our world, that became a breakthrough. The moment you discover that the moment is never in isolation floating, the moment has a whole world that supports it, and that gives practices, that tells you in terms of your identity, who you are, how related you are. So that's another breakthrough that this work brings. Then the other one is remembering. It is it's hyphenated, remembering, meaning that the moment you enter these moments, people remember a whole string of moments, and they can put those moments back into the membership of their life. And therefore it is remembering. And that's the other breakthrough that I see people. It is, there was one guy the next morning after we spoke about moments the first day, the next moment he came back and he said he had a narrative attack the previous night. The stories, yes, all of the moments and all of the stories put up their hands, and they all wanted to tell him things. So the moment you open up one story that matters to you deeply, the brothers and sisters and nephews and cousins all come walking into your life, walking, and in a sense, walking back into your life, because they're already there. They might just be hidden and not visible enough. And the other breakthrough that I saw with a leader working in a big organization is that she said the moment that moment came back to her, she felt as if the earth tilted back on its axis. And she could feel herself related to the world again. Now, this has huge implications for how she shows up as a leader, how she works with her teams, how she sells the vision of the company when the moment that she is back into the world and she feels related and grounded in this world. There's a lot of people that I've experienced in this work that kind of feels that they're walking sideways in their bodies, not physically, but something is off all the time. And once we enter these moments, it is as if there's a rootedness and relatedness that comes back into all our relationships in the world. So those are some of the aspects that I've seen that brings the breakthrough to people. And what I've experienced with this work, because it's facilitated in moments and meaning, the meaning at this part is embodied meaning. Because I've re-experienced the moment, what I know then is not just intellectually, but my body has shifted in a particular way. And the people's actions flow from that. There's no action plan needed. It's not like the next week I'm going to do 3 things, because I have re-experienced, and in that re-experiencing, re-authored, something has bodily shifted in a certain sense, so that people live differently and talk differently afterwards. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
It does. A lot of the groups I work with, have this idea that when we tell the story, it will then later we can use that story to get something else. And the thing I say to them is, no, that the shift has already happened. It's happened right here in the room. Change is happening now. We're already in change because we're telling the way we're telling the story and drawing new meaning from the story.
And because we are co-creating meaning together. That's the other thing. With organizations, when they gather, it is a moment. Or they are creating a moment together from which they collectively make new meaning. And that's why it's so important in organizational work. So often people would say, oh, we don't have the time, When you ask for a day, you get a half day. When you ask half day, you get 2 hours.
Yes.
But this is the redemption of time. Because if we are languaging beings and meaning-making beings, if we spend the time together, the time we win is priceless. Because we don't have to go back and say, why did we do that? Or why did we say that? Everybody was in the room making meaning together. And that's so powerful to me, to see that happen. So there's also collective embodiment happening in a certain sense.
So as we're listening, my sense is that our audience is getting an awareness of just how deep this work can be and how disciplined it can be. And since this learning encounter is focused on equipping people who are saying, I'd like to take the next step, obviously there would be enormous benefit to somebody working with a coach like you, who's been in this work for a long time and is very thoughtful about it. And there's also a sense in which all of us are doing this work all the time, just not fully aware that we're doing it. So for those who are looking to take the next step and saying, I'm interested in reauthoring my story, or talking to my partner or my colleague in having a reauthoring kind of conversation, what might you say to that person?
Well, it's going to sound boring, hey, because it's going to be about a moment.
Good.
So
that's not boring at all. I love it.
So for instance, somebody would say, I am really thinking about abundance in my life at the moment. And the question would be, firstly, take me to a moment when you first became aware that abundance is important to you. And then you go through all that portals. Take us there. What was the senses? What was happening in nature if nature was present? Art, beauty, what's happening in your body? Who would not be surprised in your life? We always are interested in the social histories, the legacies of the things that matter to us. Abundance didn't fall from the sky. Abundance was cultivated by a community somewhere. You saw it happening, you experienced it in some way. So how can we bring in the story keepers and ask about why can you remember that abundance was important to you? If we take abundance as an example.
So may I jump in and make an observation about what you just shared? Because the question is so important, because somebody says abundance and your response is, oh, tell me about a moment when you felt abundant.
Take me to.
Not
tell.
Yeah, beautiful, even better. But this is very... So, oh, wow. I want to hear about that as well. But before we do, I just want to note that that's very different than what most people do, which is, abundance. What do you mean by that?
Which you could say also be a question, but it doesn't give you the nuances of the experience. It might give you an intellectual philosophizing about abundance.
And to me, that strikes me as a really critical shift that a lot of people miss. There's a big difference between tell me how you define that word and take me to a moment where you experienced that. because when you do that, I find that there's actually a shift that happens in the body. You can, if you're self-aware, you feel it happen. You know, tell me what abundance means to you. I'll answer from up here in my head.
Exactly.
Take me to a moment. I'll actually feel it move down into my body. Right.
Exactly. And therefore, this is transformational work, because the body cannot lie. When it's in the body and the body experiences it, something else happens. And this idea, I must just say, I stand on the shoulders of Hans Ulrich Gombrich, who wrote a book, The Production of Presence, What Meaning Cannot Convey. And he spoke about the oscillation between presence and meaning. And I just put in moments and meaning. He says we live in a world where we are constantly making meaning. We cannot not make meaning. So on this level.
Right.
And he says if we can just stay a little bit longer in presence, so that we can feel the soft touch of the world on our skin. And this is for me the work, is holding people in that moment, so that they can remember in a meaningful way, so that whatever meaning then comes is different than just our intellectual observation about, for instance, abundance.
Tell me quickly about the difference between tell me about a moment versus take me to a moment.
I can, whoops, sorry, there's a storm coming.
You need to go check on something?
No, it was just a door.
Okay.
Slammed. Tell me about can purely stay on an intellectual level. I can tell you about I can tell you, okay, for instance, I can tell you that I know a very good friend, Olivia, and she writes about tomato economics, which is about abundance. I am not in the story yet. I am telling you about something. But I can also say the last time I experienced abundance was at the ocean, where I just come from, where I walked up to a very familiar path. But in the high tide, the ocean took the sand away, and there was multiple small waterfalls. And I just experienced the abundance of nature, and I felt it in my body. Now I can go on and on in portals. Why does that matter? What was the beauty? And then you can go through all the questions, the senses. But is that an answer to your question?
Yes, it is. You're giving me some ideas. I'm actually going to try some things differently. Actually, this week when I go to work with some leaders.
I would love to hear. Let me know.
I absolutely will. I'm learning a lot from you. So many of our listeners are from an organizational context. Not all of them, but many of them are. And that's the world that I'm in most often. So let me bring this back to a leadership context. This conversation that we're having about coming through these portals and having this very human conversation. I encounter over and over again with my leaders when we do this in a conference room, you know, in a big shiny glass tower somewhere, that for some this feels like a weird thing to talk about at work, and they're not used to showing up with more of their hearts or more of who they are. Do you encounter that, and how do you manage that conversation with leaders in a corporate setting who are saying, I'm not used to being this vulnerable. This feels different or strange?
So it's usually too late when they say this is too vulnerable, because they've already had the experience. But in leaders, and in all my work, I work with small groups of 3 people. And I always ask them to choose a stranger. Because when they choose somebody, people that they know or their friends, they cannot be surprised about their own life. So having some fresh eyes on you. So I asked them to choose a stranger and to have this conversation. But there are very strict rules. No judgment, no fixing allowed, no assumptions allowed. Please be carefully curious. Ask questions you don't know the answer to. Be open to be transformed by somebody else. And what I've seen in that the small group of three, that it's intimate enough for us not to feel that I'm now vulnerable to everybody, but I'm vulnerable to the two people. And what I've seen leaders said, there was, I teach here at the Stellenbosch Business School, and one leader once said, now that I've heard not only people's story, but the heart of their story, I will follow them wherever they go. And so this, the moment thing is a bit sneaky. So there's nothing in Take Me to a Moment that would make leaders think, oh, this is going to be vulnerable. So it is in the way you set up the questions, you make it safe in a group of three people with whom they share. And then I always end the ritual, for me it's a ritual in the groups of three, with a gift conversation, where they share how they have been touched or moved by what they heard. And that part is a bit freaky to some. But to be seen by a stranger, my life to be seen and to be witnessed is such a rare thing that people would say, I have had a conversation today that I haven't had with my family even. But these are simple questions that the questions also need to take people there. And then, yes, they might end up saying, I've been vulnerable. How does this work? All of that, all of the going back into the head questions. But what I've seen in those small groups of three, community is created and connectedness is created. And the possibility of a different future is created because I have been witnessed. Not in a polished version of a story, but in its bareness and its unfinishedness, which I find quite spectacular to watch. Because you see the body shift in the room afterwards, and the kind of conversation we're having is different. And this same is also, it's not only to do with leader stories, also has to do with organizational stories. So take us to a moment in this organization that you were really proud, but take us there, not tell about, all the steps and how did it work, but what did it do to us and what becomes possible from that place. It feels like the future is reauthored in the present. It's as if you are snatching the moment out of the clutches of time and can go free, and a new future can be imagined because of that. Is that answering your question?
Brilliant, just brilliant. So here at Story of the Future Learning Encounter, as people are taking the next step into this work, we're very interested in accountability in this work as well, because a story is like fire, and fire can purify and it can illuminate, but it can also burn. And so we want people to work with narrative in ways that are generative. As our audience is considering stepping into these moments and these conversations of reauthoring and meaning making, do you have some words of counsel or caution or things to think about or boundaries that need to be set?
Well, as a facilitator and a coach, you always come with tremendous power into the room. So when somebody says something and you say, oh, so what you're really saying is this, you are using your power and taking that person's words away. So for me, the biggest caution is how you play with power as a facilitator and a coach, and how you deconstruct your power by learning with people and entering with people. And the gifts, therefore, is a very powerful way. After every coaching conversation, I am touched, I am moved. I might change my mind about something because I listen to you. And I share that with you. And I've always found that to be such a special moment when power can be deconstructed in a way that people receive gifts. So that would be very important, our relationship to power, and that when we enter, what we say, how we say it, to whom we say it matters, and always being aware of that. The other things we already spoke about, you know, when we are taken to a moment, you have to, because we are so used to telling about things, you have to constantly take people back to the moment. If they have given you a short version of the moment, that's what we would call a thin description of the moment. You have to pause and then use your power and say, can we go back? I didn't fully experience it, or doesn't fully understand what that moment was about. So that is very important. Otherwise, it's just going to be a telling from the head. Dignity, human dignity, is super important for me. And in a certain sense, when we witness and come alongside people in the bringing back of moments, for me, that is a re-dignifying practice. We are bringing dignity back into the remembering of something that matters to somebody deeply. When I work with organizations, and I don't have much time, which is often, I work with stories that moves us forward. I don't have the time for problem stories. I can't be stuck in moments of problem stories because I don't have enough time to spend with people to also hear the other stories. And so for me, that's a very strong practice that I have, that if you want to give me 2 hours, a half day or a day, we are working with stories that move you forward. Because otherwise, we are in the middle of something at the end of the day. And we haven't had the full picture. So that's also one of the practices that I do. Problem stories, 2 days, please. or 1 day on problem stories with some pre-work. Right. So those are some of the boundaries that I see. Because if we want to work with dignity around problem stories in particular, people are so used to ways of talking or having conflict that are entrenched. So if we want to bring other practices of dignity, of language, of careful curiosity, we have to practice it the whole day so that we have a different kind of conversation about problems. Problems not inside of people, but we are always in relationship to problem stories, which sometimes is just a problem moment. But problem stories are very sneaky. They tell you that they've been there for a long time and always been there, and this is a huge problem. So I don't know if that's enough rules for now.
No, that's incredibly helpful. You know, it's funny. As part of Story of the Future, I've had an opportunity to interview a lot of people and have a lot of wonderful conversations. And this dialogue with you, more than others, has me reflecting on my own practices. And when I'm in the room with my clients, being more present and sensitive to what's happening. And I'm always thinking about power dynamics, and I'm always thinking about vulnerability and the balance between head and heart and all those dynamics in the room. And I find myself now wanting to talk about those things even more. And perhaps our listeners are in a similar place, if not on that issue. I'm sure there are many other things to talk about. And that is where our Facebook page comes in. So these conversations are always the beginning of the dialogue. These recorded conversations are never the end of the dialogue. It's the beginning. Come over to our Facebook page. I want to talk about what I heard and what I'm experiencing and what I'm reflecting about from this conversation with Chine. And I want to hear what your questions are as well. So I hope that you will join us there, remain in the circle of conversation, bring your own insights and perceptions and meaning and moments to this conversation. And finally, I'd like to remind you, that this week we will have 2 live events, one with Christina Baldwin, and then another one with Madeline Blair, and thinking about how story and resilience, our personal resilience, are connected. And that will be part of the All Access Pass, those live conversations where you'll really have an opportunity to roll up your sleeves and ask some questions and start connecting narrative practice to your own practice as a story activist. Chine, thank you so much for sharing part of your day with us for a second time, and for being in the circle with us here at Story of the Future. And until our next conversation, I hope that each of our listeners will find themselves in moments where they will find themselves deeply present in moments worth telling the story about. Thank you very much, Chine.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
Hey, everybody. So I ended this conversation so quickly, and afterwards Chine said, oh, I have a gift to give. And so I've unpaused the video. Chine, you're just so lovely.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David, for your questions. You said before, things to think about. And the questions really helped me to become clearer. I always have this, people say, oh, this is a bit wishy-washy, a bit weird. So your questions were a gift of clarity to me. And thank you. Thank you also for your engagement in this conversation. I always have doubts when I speak, and this conversation really helped me to bring what was ready to be brought in this season of my life. So thank you, David. I really appreciate it, and I'm touched and moved by this.
Well, and thank you for your gift of bringing that authenticity and that honesty, because the thing that's not happening enough is, I mean, there are beautiful people in the world who are deeply immersed in this work that's narrative work, and we're not talking to each other enough, and I'm certainly guilty of that. And I need to be in dialogue with you and with Mary Alice and, oh my goodness, with Christina. Everybody wants to be in dialogue with Christina. She's such a beautiful person. But that's why we're doing this, is so that we can all face one another and say, here's what I'm trying.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what I'm a little insecure or vulnerable about. Here's what I have some questions about. And to hear that other people are asking those same questions, it is a powerful gift. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you once again to our listeners.